Welcome to the making of the Suzy Dent video. It was while the band were rehearsing what was then a new song in the set that Paul had written that discussions first arose over whether to do a video to help promote it, as we was going to record a song at Suff Studios in Cologne to become the band's next single release. As both myself and Paul had already done some green screen video for another project, it was suggested we do the same again by creating a CG model of the Channel 4 set, which is actually filmed at Granada Studios in Media City, as the chances of getting access to the Countdown set was probably zero, or it would be a vast sum of money to hire, plus issues of copyright and image rights etc. included, and the logistics of getting the band together and getting there with all the equipment we would need, plus an email I sent that was ignored put any idea of filming it at the studio or even asking for permission out of reach. So the next step was finding pictures of what the studio set was like, to give me an idea of scale and its layout, as watching the show itself doesn't give you many clues as to its size or even how the set is built. The one thing that makes CG in films and videos authentic looking is attention to the minute details, something that we hardly notice in real life except for when that detail isn't there. A search of the internet for pictures mostly show you either the standard face-on shot of the contestants and the clock, with the letters board cropped at the bottom of the screen, or the presenter shots, which again are relatively close-up shots not revealing much about the set. But I finally found a few that I could get an idea from and try to create the set in a 3D computer graphics environment. The things that had to be taken into consideration were things like the studio layout, the back curtain and how it was lit, desk colours and the textures, the back wall texture behind the contestants and presenters, the scale of the objects in comparison to the people and other objects, lighting positions, shadows, camera positions in the show, what we could actually use from a camera perspective, and how I could storyboard this together to make an entertaining video. So after looking at the reference pics, I started by modelling the desk, which was difficult in getting the curve of it right, and the clock and its colours, the back wall and the curtain behind it, and a camera placement that we could use in the video. I was also just using one light at this point to illuminate all the models. As you can see, when the contestant shot is overlaid, I was still a little bit out with the sizes and scale, but was getting there. And at this point, I added some colours to the models that matched what I could see in the reference pics. The closest textures I could find that matched were a rust texture for the front of the desk, which seemed to look right. Also at this point, I added the additional circle for the letters board and added a brass texture for the railing above the back wall. I gave Andrew, our bass player, the task of recreating the back wall screen texture behind the contestants, as while I was making the set, time was becoming a factor in getting it finished, as we had already booked the studio time. The triangle-shaped thing, in case you were wondering, is a virtual camera that is used to render or show the finished scene. I made a few scale adjustments to the desk and the back wall, and made a chair that is in front of the clock, again to try and get a sense of scale, and when we then overlaid the two reference pics, you can see the set model was getting closer to what we needed, but the chair was obviously oversized at this point. Base textures on the clock were applied, although I knew that the clock face itself would be replaced by an animation in the post-production final edits. So noticing at this point on the reference pics I had that there were two yellow strip lights down the side of the clock base and what looked like a grille on the base front. Railing poles were added to the top of the back wall and I started to line them up with the reference pics I was using. I asked Andrew again to have a look at the circle texture on the floor in front of the desk and see if he could come up with something to match. But I noticed an issue. The contestant reference pics I was using didn't match the studio reference pics I was using for the models, which is when I discovered that the Countdown set had been remodelled for the new season that was due to air on Channel 4, and the studio pics were from that, and hence the discrepancies that I was noticing. Back to the studio reference shot, I noticed how the top bar of the railing on the back wall screen was split and bent down behind the clock. There appeared to be a yellow light or lights underneath the front of the desk. The railing texture also looked like steel or aluminium, and the back wall itself was split into sections rather than being a complete wall. The back wall was adjusted to include this detail, and I added some yellow lights underneath the desk, and started to add further detail to the stage circle where the letters board is positioned, as well as adding additional detail to the base of the clock, as well as bending the top railing down to where the clock is positioned. and made a slight adjustment to the virtual camera position as a storyboard on how to film and record what we was going to do was beginning to form. Next came the letters board and how to make this and get its scale and textures right, the floor layout underneath it and the position of a camera that could be used in the video. Again, using reference pics that I found on the internet was obviously the way to go. The chair to the right that the presenter sits on was also taken into consideration, and how to make this and the textures that were on it, and the position of the letters stage circle. I found another reference shot that also gave me an idea of where the letters stage was in position to the main desk, and gave me a better look at its floor and how it had been constructed, this looking like a brass metal texture on the circle components. Lighting is one of the most critical things in computer graphics and animation. It is something we take for granted in our daily lives in the real world. The sun and how different times of the day it can affect the colour of things around us. Even in our homes, lights have a dramatic effect that we rarely notice, and how this lighting can affect our mood and feelings with various colours being classed as warm or cold, this being something I have become more attuned to since I began modelling things in 3D. I have spent hours watching how the sun affects the colours on the houses behind where I live, and how even the white rendering on a house opposite is rarely pure white. Thankfully, the main reference pic I'd found gave me a good idea of where the lights are and how they were used to light the studio set. And as you can see from this, how these lights interacted with the components and colours of the set and how the shadows are reduced. From the reference pic, I was able to see that 12 lights were used on the curtain behind the set, as well as between 4 and 6 lights being used to light the main set. I had to guess where the placements were, but as long as I got the results I needed, hopefully the model would look the same. As you can see, the virtual lights were placed in guesstimate places to try and duplicate and simulate the studio lighting. One of the great things about 3D modelling software I use is the fact you can show what is called the cone, this being where the main beam of the light is most powerful. There are various different sorts of lights that can be used in 3D, each one doing a slightly different job. So if I enable the cones, you can see where the virtual lights will illuminate, this obviously helping to set up the lighting for the models. If I then go to our main camera view and render it or show how it will look at this point, you can see they are far too bright and bleeding out the colours of the textures, making it look completely unnatural or what is called washed out. After I then reduced the amount the virtual lights were emitting, I then rendered the scene from another virtual camera I set up to try and replicate one of the reference pics I'd found to see how and if the lights were matching what was happening in the real world. If I then overlay the reference pic, you can see I was beginning to get close, but as you can see the reflections from the floor and other models doesn't exactly match, but I already knew that this shot was purely for a reference for me to use and would not be part of the final video. Next, I added 3 additional presenter chairs and slightly changed the position and scale of a few things, increased the reflection amount on a number of surface textures and created the chair the presenter sits on next to the letters board. Finally adding the screens what the presenters and contestants look at on top of the desk. But then, this happened.
1, 2, 3, 4. She's a lexicon lost it a little bit.
One of the big parts of Countdown is the presenters and contestants sat behind the desk, and I already knew that this shot from the finished video would be part of it. So how was it done? Back in Studio 41, I set up the green screen and lights, the goal being to capture the band singing the song and trying to see if it was possible to create the illusion that we were sat behind the Countdown desk. When using a green screen, the idea is to get what's called a good key, meaning basically no shadows or keeping the background shadows behind the object or person, in this case to a minimum. Paul was first up to take the chair, so let me show you the process and how it was done. First, you obviously have to film it where we mime to the song. Second, we add what's called a mask. This helps when processing the green screen, as the software has a smaller area to target, and you can animate this mask if needed to take out any parts that could prove difficult in the processing. Third, I remove the side masks as they aren't needed anymore. And fourth, the key is added to remove the green screen, this then allowing any further processing to be applied to the image, and we are ready to go. Next up, Andrew. Particular note must be made of the eyebrow look that he has, and it pained me that this didn't make the final video, but again the same process is applied. Then Luke was next. Now for the astute among you, you may have noticed that his left hand has a plaster cast on it, full of coloured dots. Paul explains later in the video what the cast is about, but the original idea was to superimpose some structure onto the cast using the dots as tracking points, another common thing used in CG. Unfortunately, the time constraints to do this meant it wasn't possible, but the same green screen process was applied. Finally, it was my turn, and I thought, just shake your head about and sing, but again, with the same process being applied. So to sit the band behind the desk meant breaking down the now finished model set in two layers. Firstly, the back curtain and the wall, then adding the clock with my original guide texture on it. Next, the actual animated clock was added as another layer. The breakdown of the animated clock was in several parts. If I switch the parts on and off, you can see how it's made up to get what I needed. So the clock could be seen working behind us in the video. If I scroll along the timeline of the clock, you can see the hand was animated to turn. Back to the main shot, and let's bring the band into it as separate layers. Now my original intention was to animate the chairs I had made that you saw in the modelling stage, but I forgot to place a separate green screen on the chair while filming, so we went with the desk chair I use at Studio 41. The positions of the band sat on the chair wasn't critical, just as long as it looked like we were sat behind the desk. Then to finish off, I added the desk and floor as a separate layer in front of us, ready for any colour correction in post-processing. Next up was filming Paul by himself, and it was suggested that he hold a dictionary while singing the song, obviously so it could be used as separate shots or scenes within the video. Unfortunately, I discovered in my modest selection of books that the only thing I have at Studio 41 that could be classed as a dictionary is the Penguin Rhyming Dictionary, which for those of you who are interested is a good source for rappers, so we went with him holding that while miming to the song. Now, one of the great things about doing filming like this is the fact you sometimes capture unintentional footage that can then be included in the video. For example, Paul doing a small dance while waiting for the next verse. I followed the same process as I did for the chair shots, using masks to take out the unneeded bits, and taking out the green screen to allow me to put any background I wish behind him. Andrew suggested that he could mock up a book cover of a Suzy Dent fictional book that could be applied at the post-processing stage. But again, due to time constraints, as an additional green screen shoot was planned at Red Wall Rehearsal Studios, thanks to Cal the owner for this, I ran out of time to create the resource required, hence shots like this were unused in the final video. Another shot from the finished video that I've been asked about how it was done is where myself, Andrew and Luke are running behind the desk. My original plan was just to have us jigging about behind Paul while he was singing for obvious entertainment purposes. So to try and explain to the band what I was after, I was first up to Much Mirth As You Can Hear. Now, due to the space available, it seemed that just dancing or running on the spot was all we could do, with the band being entertained while doing this. And as you can probably guess, the same process was applied as with the previous chair shots, using the masks, and as you can see in this sequence, the mask was animated to help with processing the green screen. Apply the green screen filter, remove the side masks, and we are ready to go. Next up was Andrew, and the same process applied with the mask and green screen filter while entertaining the band again. Then it was Luke's turn to entertain us with the same processes applied again to get the result I needed. The next part was how do I use the running on the spot takes in the actual finished video. I soon realised that due to me changing the camera angle, why I've no idea, I no longer had our feet in the shot, meaning I would have to use the shots with us behind something. So I decided to use the main desk shot again and have us dancing behind it. It then dawned on me that I could probably make it look like we were running across behind the desk by animating the separate clips across the modelled set. One way to add depth to a CG scene so it doesn't look like a flat image is to add shadows to whatever is in the shot. This can be done in a number of ways, for example using virtual lights applied during the scene processing stage. The problem here was the set itself though. Something I noticed after creating the back wall was that it actually had gaps between the sections, meaning that if there is a shadow it will disappear when it goes over the gap. So as you can see from the scene, there is a shadow behind each of us on the back wall and the clock as we move across the virtual countdown set. As I move the cursor along the timeline, the shadows disappear where the gaps are, and obviously appear again where there is no gap. The next issue is shadows going across the front of the clock, as these will be different, because the clock stands out from the back wall and will be closer to us and therefore need a different shadow. This proved to be the most challenging part of creating the entire Suzy Dent video. This therefore involved creating two separate shadows for each of us and then animating them to track us across the wall and also across the clock. The technique I eventually used was taking the footage of us dancing, and I use that term very loosely, and animating them across the screen and setting the image to what is called a classic colour dodge. Without going into too much detail, this turns the image black with sharp edges. The next problem is, and you may or may not have noticed this about shadows, is that they don't have very sharp edges. So I applied a blur to the shadow to give it a diffuse or faded edge. And if we look at the clip, you can see how this was done. If you look though, there are no gaps for the wall as the images move across the screen. So if we break the layers down, then build it back up starting with the curtain, back wall, then the clock, and add the two sets of shadows, you can see that they disappear as they go across the gaps. If we therefore just concentrate on one set of shadows, you can see there are masks covering the gaps and one for the clock. And then if I bring in the rest of the background, you can see where the masks are. Taking the first set of shadows, if I scroll along the timeline, you will see the shadows disappear going across the gaps and disappear where the clock is, as this is where the second set of shadows go. And as you've probably guessed, another mask was applied here just for the shadows to appear going across it. As you have seen, once the green screen filter or the key is applied, you can pretty much add any background you wish to the video footage, as long as you remember that the scale and placement of the virtual camera, as well as the lighting conditions of the background, need to match. The solo footage of Paul being an example where I could put him in any of the shots of the studio. The clock is missing in a few of them, but obviously this would have been added if the shots would have been used in the final video. So we still needed some green screen, full band footage for the video, and the best place to do them was Red Wall where we rehearse. But then we had a gig.
Good evening. So, thanks for buying tickets for this tonight, and it's actually it's cost you about £2 because you get a free album. So you got so for £2 you see Loop and us. It's a fucking bargain, isn't it? Shut up.
When do we get the album?
Anyway, just April, by the way. So this is what's happened this week. Our normal drummer, Luke over here, just put your hand up and show everybody. Hey! He fell over. He said he wasn't drunk. So he couldn't do the gig, so we've got young Al over here. Keeping it in the family, Al Entwistle, my brother-in-law. And there's no pressure on him at all, of course. Anyway, this is a song called Suzy Dent.
Now the problem here, as previously mentioned, was Luke's hand, but both me and Paul realised that it could be an opportunity to include footage from the doghouse, with our very good friend and Paul's brother-in-law Al deputising for Luke. As you can see, the way around this was we put a picture of Suzy in front of his head and tracked the picture to where his head was moving. Paul suggested why not put it on us all, and this is how it looked. We had about 7 hours to get set up and basically shoot as much footage as possible of the band playing together, as well as individual shots of us playing our instruments. Again, I already had an idea of what we would need to accomplish to get the scenes for the video. I needed some help with the camera and setup, so I asked a good friend Mandy Hart to give us a lift with camera duties while we mimed along to the track. The main issue again was trying to reduce any shadows with the positioning of the lights we were using, but to also try and keep them levelled across the whole band, i.e. getting us all lit the same. Obviously with no budget whatsoever to do this, and after reviewing the footage back at Studio 41, I noticed that Paul was lit too much, and again, due to the time constraints to get the video finished, I didn't have time to correct this. So as before, once the green screen was keyed out, I could place any background and foreground objects into the shoot, including the letters board like can be seen in the countdown show. Paul and myself was trying to think what we could put on them, and Suzy's name seemed appropriate, although I made a mistake by spelling her name wrong, but we decided to let it go as it filled the entire letters board. The slight movements of the camera also added to the footage, and the way around this was to choose a static spot, in this case a spot on the drums, to track the background to match the movements of the camera. Once the band shoot was completed, and with the drum kit and keyboards still set up, Luke and myself were up and we mimed along with just the chorus and the first verse, as this would provide footage that could be repeated anywhere in the song if needed. One problem though was the chrome on the drum kit reflecting the green screen, more on this in a minute, and the fact we wanted the band logo on the front kick drum skin, more on this too. And as before, a bit of movement in the camera added a bit more realism to the shots we got. Next I decided more footage of Luke would be good, but the reflectingness of the chrome stands and even the symbols created an issue with the green screen key. Andrew was next, and as you can see, various parts of the footage were used that made the final video. And then finally, it was footage of Paul, and again, due to time constraints, I asked Mandy to get a few close-up shots that I was able to use, which normally would have been done as a separate shoot. As before, a mask was applied to take out the ceiling of the room, and the picture I had of the UkePunk logo was added as a mask to the front of the kick drum skin. But with Paul jigging about in front of the drums, the mask had to be animated to match his leg movements. So if we break down the layers of the full band shot and then add them back, you can see the logo is a layer by itself. But by adding the letters board, this meant that there was a lot less work to do animating the logo. If I select the logo layer, you can see how the animation tracks what Paul's leg is doing as I scroll along the timeline for this footage, and then a gap where it isn't, obviously replacing these sections with the letters board where the footage would be used. I again applied the same mask and green screen techniques to myself on Luke and adding the logo to the kick drum front skin, which this time didn't need to be animated, although it was tracked to the drum kit and the background too, plus allowing me to again apply the letters board to the shot. Next was Andrew's footage, and with the stand for his base also reflecting the green screen, a number of masks had to be applied to the stand so it wouldn't disappear when the green screen key was applied, with some of them needing to be animated as he jigged about playing the bass. So if we turn the main ones off and then switch the green screen key off and the main mask around him, but leave the one around his leg and stand switched on, you can see the animation of the mask. Then if we put the key back on, this then helped in placing any background behind him, plus with the slight movement of the camera, it added a bit more realism again, tracking the background to a point on the base which also allowed the zoom. I had also taken a GoPro camera which we could attach to the top of the base to give another view, although at that point I wasn't exactly sure how we would use the footage from it. An idea again from Paul was to make it look like photos of Suzy were being thrown onto the stage. If we have a look at this layer, it was made up of 7 pictures which were then added to what is called a particle system. I could do another video just on particle systems, but the way you can set them up is to randomly distribute them onto a scene, giving the effect that they are appearing as if they are randomly moving within the footage. If we actually select one of them, called Particle World, you can see a grid appears representing the floor. So this is where they land, but as you can see, some of them land on the edge to the floor, which is really impossible. But due to time constraints and the fact that this would be just a quick clip in the video, there was no point in spending more time correcting this. If we have a look at how the scene was created and the green screen key is switched off, and then the background floor is, and the photos are removed, and I actually center the shot, you can see another animated mask was used to track Andrew's fingers, and to take out the unwanted floor and someone's legs. Another quick shot was Paul sat next to Suzy at the desk. A mask was placed around the other presenter, and as luck would have it, a shot of Paul from the earlier green screen shoot just happened to fit. So if I remove the shot of Paul, you can see the co-presenter. Next, the GoPro camera was put on the end of the ukulele, and again an animated mask was applied, so to take out the unwanted parts of the rehearsal room. If we then switch the mask on, apply the green screen key, and then add one of the existing shots of the virtual studio, which I now placed at an approximate angle to match, which was then tracked to the background shot. Put this all together and we had the finished video. I hope you have enjoyed this breakdown of the video and given you an idea into how green screens are used in modern filmmaking. And thank you for watching.